Imagine you're Mikel Arteta. You've had a turbulent time as Arsenal manager, but this season, it's finally starting to click. Your squad depth is elite. Your backline is generational. You're firing on all cylinders. In fact, people are starting to question if your team can do the unthinkable, something that's never been done by a club in Premier League history. That was until you came up short in the League Cup final to your old boss, and crashed out of the FA Cup to a team in the league below. Arsenal would have loved nothing more than to have beat City to win the first trophy of the season, or cruise past Southampton on their way to Wembley. Arteta hasn't won a trophy for the Gunners since 2020, and the quadruple dream would have been well and truly alive. But what's arguably just as important is that Pep and his City side have regained the psychological advantage. As amazing as Arsenal have been this season, something still feels a bit off. You can't put your finger on it, but if any other team was sitting in this position going into April, you'd feel like they'd already be over the line. But Arsenal, they just have a history of shooting themselves in the foot. Whether it's the scrutiny from the press, the agendas from rival fans, or even the self-destruction of the team itself, Arsenal somehow find themselves always feeling like prey. The thing is, this isn't just a funny agenda, it's science. And human nature has shown time and time again that we struggle to perform when we feel like we're in the firing line. In fact, the more we experience being chased, the worse it gets. And if Arteta and this team can't break free from the hunted mentality, then history might just repeat itself. But before we look at this season's epic title race, we need to understand what the dynamic between predator and prey is really like. When you're being hunted, your life is on the line. Your heart rate is through the roof. Anxiety and adrenaline is coursing through your veins. Your body is in overdrive. It's quite literally a life or death situation. Being a hunter is completely different. It's aggression, not anxiety. Composure, not panic. Every mistake is an opportunity for you to close in on your next meal. And whilst it's essential that you eat, more often than not, it won't be your life that's on the line. Humans are apex predators. We have been for hundreds of thousands of years. We're not used to being prey. But sport is one area of life which can evoke the emotions of being hunted. In fact, studying athletes is where psychologists have made huge progress with performance anxiety and choking under pressure. It's certainly prevalent in football, as we'll get into later, but many other sports showcase the phenomenon perfectly. MMA, Formula 1, athletics, they all seem to benefit the hunter. Everyone wants the title fight, everyone's chasing the leading driver, everyone's striving for the world record. Getting to the top is much easier than staying there. Lewis Hamilton, statistically the greatest F1 driver of all time, said he much preferred being the hunter, even though he spent 30% of his Mercedes career leading races. To help deal with the pressure, he'd even imagine himself further ahead on the track so he could have something to chase, instead of dwelling on being hunted by 19 other drivers. He framed himself as the hunter in his own mind to keep himself on top, and Hamilton specifically said that you can almost get away with making mistakes when you're not in the lead. But they feel so much more significant and nerve-wracking when you know that everyone else is looking to capitalise on that mistake. Golf is a sport which epitomises pressure, arguably more than any other, because players have so much more time to think about everything at stake, and it's more than common to see great golfers completely self-destruct on the final day of a major, and play well below their standard. It's like they're their own worst enemy. Football as a sport is much more intense, which should make it harder to choke, because in the heat of a cup final, your adrenaline and instincts take over. But much more like golfers, the managers have all the time in the world to overthink every detail, and this might just be why Arsenal feel so cursed. But again, we'll get into that later. We've seen players, and teams as a collective, succumb to immense pressure on the football pitch. Gerrard's slip, Baggio's penalty, Dortmund's league collapse, and the common theme with all these instances is that the individuals or teams felt the pressure of expectation and failed to do what should have been their bread and butter. Events like penalties are naturally a high pressure moment, but we're more interested in the effects over a longer period of time, specifically in league formats. And the Premier League over the last few seasons is actually the perfect place to start, because before Arteta's Arsenal became renowned for choking the league, it was actually Liverpool who were the victims of Pep's ruthless Manchester City side. In the 2018-19 season, the title race went down to the wire. It was one of the best displays of football from both teams that we've ever seen. Halfway through the season, Liverpool actually led by 6 points, with a mind-boggling 51 points from 19 games. They went to the Etihad on game week 21 and lost a narrow classic, and then after a few draws in January and February, they lost their lead by game week 29. and that's all she wrote. They lost one game all season, away at City, and that was enough to end their title hopes. Pep's side actually lost away to Newcastle on the 29th of January, before winning 14 in a row to close out the title. It's just ridiculous. I'm not even saying that Liverpool crumbled under the pressure, and they certainly didn't choke an easy lead. They were going toe-to-toe with arguably the greatest Premier League side of all time. But it's interesting that both of Liverpool's recent Premier League titles were basically one-horse races by Christmas. It's a lot easier to focus on your own results and play good football when you don't have Pep's Prem-winning machine breathing down your neck. And if anyone knows what that feels like, it's Mikel Arteta. In the 2022-23 season, Arsenal led City from the first game of the campaign until late April. That's 84% of the season spent ahead of their title rivals. The gap fluctuated, peaking at 8 points halfway through the season, but when it got tight, Arsenal felt the pressure and drew 3 games in a row, losing their lead after a 3-3 at home to bottom of the table Southampton. City, much like against Liverpool a few years before, won a ridiculous amount of games in a row to close out the league. Once they get teams in their sights during that crunch time of the season, the result almost feels inevitable. Don't get me wrong, City have led the league in close title races and managed to hold out, but they've won 6 of the last 8 Premier Leagues. They don't bear anywhere near as much pressure as their rivals, especially Arsenal, who haven't won the Premier League in more than 20 years, and are desperate to return to the heights of English football. And I think this ties back to the hunter versus hunted mentality perfectly. As amazing as City are, they've spent a significant amount of time chasing in their title races. And from one angle, this implies weakness through drop points and lost games, but they seem to really hit their flow state towards the end of the season, and are so used to being the hunter when the league's on the line. And they're the only team that's managed to win a close title race in recent years. But if City were to fall short coming from behind, the discourse would be completely different. It feels like they win numerous trophies every season. They've got nothing to lose. It's not a life or death situation. But for Arsenal, it kind of feels like it is. But you really don't want to be thinking about winning the Premier League as evading a predator chasing you from behind. You almost want to channel that predatory aggression yourself. But like Hamilton said, it's a lot easier said than done when you're the target at the top of the table. You almost wonder if their strong starts hindered them later in the season because of the pressure and expectations they set for themselves out the gate. I'm sure if City dropped a few more points in January, Arsenal could have a comfy 14-point lead, and the title would be all but wrapped up. But unfortunately for Arteta, Pep's side are still hanging around, with a game in hand and a title-deciding 6-pointer at the Etihad to play. When under threat, your working memory becomes impaired, meaning you have trouble making sense of and acting on new information, become more prone to recalling and reliving negative emotional experiences, and consciously overthinking behaviours that should be second nature. Ultimately, when choking, not only does your performance in the moment decline, but it can trigger a vicious cycle of self-doubt, shame, guilt and fear, making it all the more likely you'll choke again, and limit taking future risks. These are the words of behavioural scientists from the IMD Business School in Lausanne, Switzerland, and I'm sure we've all had experience that evoked such emotion. A presentation in front of your whole class, asking someone out on a date, taking the deciding penalty in a shootout. Humans struggle to deal with the emotion of pressure, and the threat response frequently leads to reactions that don't really make sense. The problem with this, as underlined by the scientists, is that our bodies have a habit of reliving these experiences, specifically on an emotional level, and this might be what's happening to Arteta at the moment. Most Arsenal fans will tell you that this season feels different. They've been amazing for the last few years, don't get me wrong, but at the moment they're playing the best football since the early days of Arsene Wenger. Whether it's entertaining or not, that's another question. But they have great squad depth, a generational defence, and they're shaping how modern football is being played. Going into this international break, they're currently favourites to win the Premier League, the FA Cup and the Champions League. Everything's going as well as possible, right? Well, the more pessimistic Arsenal fans will be noticing the same patterns. Negative football, too many draws, poor performances at choke points in the season. They drew back-to-back games against Wolves and Brentford, and City shortened the gap to just 2 points. While a few weeks beforehand, when Szoboszlai scored that insane free kick against City, it looked like Arsenal were already across the line. The thing is, it might not even matter how good Arsenal are this season. They've had world-class teams before. I think mentality becomes the most important factor towards the end of the season. And if the quote is anything to go by, Arsenal might just be their own worst enemies and revert back to the panic and stress they're all so familiar with. But to Arsenal's credit, they've restored a somewhat comfortable lead at the top of the Prem, while City drew back-to-back games in similar fashion and crashed out of the Champions League. But the funny thing is, the discourse around City after this awful spell was completely different to the discourse around Arsenal when they had 2 dodgy results against Brentford and Wolves. After that last-minute equaliser at the Molineux, the press and rival fans were the first to prey on the weakness. Same old Arsenal, Bottlejobs, massive chokers, and this can't be easy from their point of view. Like Hamilton said in his interview, when you slip up when you're leading, it's just so much more devastating than from any other position. City literally made the exact same mistake, drawing 2 games in a row against poor opposition, but no one even blinked an eye. The discourse wasn't City are out of the title race, it was this is now Arsenal's title to lose. I think the psychological insight that resonates with Arsenal the most is about limiting taking future risks. Arsenal have been slammed all season for being boring and playing not to lose, and whilst this isn't completely true, the League Cup final was a perfect example of Arteta overthinking behaviours that should be second nature. I know Eze was carrying a knock, but the Arsenal lineup just looked a little off. Kepa in goal, Havertz in the 10. If I were an Arsenal fan, I wouldn't be filled with confidence an hour before kickoff. And as a neutral, you could have seen the result coming from a mile away. Even though Arsenal were favourites and they've been playing good football, you just felt like they weren't going to get it done. They didn't even play badly, but the performance wasn't anything special, and the player that could have created a spark sat on the bench the whole game. City were willing to take risks, and it was their left back bombing forward in the second half who went on to win them that game. Pep and his side have been the apex predators in English football for years now, but the funny thing is, they've had their own struggles with self-destruction, overcomplication, and what must feel in the moment like an unbreakable curse. They were favoured to win the Champions League basically every season since 2017, but some way or another, they always seem to crash out in dramatic fashion. A thriller in Monaco, VAR controversy against Spurs, a howler in Lyon, losing to Chelsea in the final, heartbreak in Madrid. There were jokes that Yaya Touré's agent put a curse on Pep to stop him winning the Champions League with City, but in 2022, most fans probably felt like it was true. With some teams, like Real Madrid, it doesn't really matter how bad they are, they just find a way to win. That Man City side, no matter how good they were, just found a way to lose. But in 2023, they finally lifted the curse, and regardless of the discourse after the final, only one thing mattered: they got over the line. I wish I could have been in the changing rooms throughout the years to witness the growth of the team, but I'm sure that there was a huge shift in mentality from 2017 to the day they finally won the Champions League. If Arsenal want to be successful this season, that's exactly what they need to do. Get over the line by any means possible. As a fan with a very limited outside perspective, it's impossible to tell how the team's feeling before every game. But as critical as we've been at some points in this video, I do think this year's Arsenal team is something different. While there have been performances that look like the Arsenal of old, there's also been games against Chelsea and Brighton where gutsy performances and positive decisions paid off. Everton came to the Emirates and put up an extremely solid performance, but Arteta's choice to bring on more attacking threat, including 16-year-old Max Dowman, won them that game. It was a great decision, he just needs to do it more. Funnily enough, all 4 goal contributions that game came from the bench, and simply from a balanced footballing point of view, this Arsenal team is probably the best in Europe. Being in the hunt for all 4 trophies in English football puts you in a group of elite teams, and when you're that good, the pressure is a guaranteed side effect. This Arsenal team, for one reason or another, is especially scrutinised by the press, but every winning team or athlete has overcome mental barriers on their way to greatness. Arsenal have experienced more external pressure than any team I can remember. It really feels like every pundit and rival fan is eagerly waiting to latch on to the smallest mistake, and all of this will make Arsenal feel more and more like prey. But they need to internalise their experiences and block out the noise, because the more they feel like it's their title to lose rather than win, the more likely they're going to revert back to the stress and panic they experienced just a few seasons ago. Whether it's through meditation, visualization, or sheer determination, there are proven ways to shift the mentality in sport. And if the Gunners can become the Predators in their own mind, and bring any major trophy home this season, the sky's really the limit for Arteta and this Arsenal side.